Book is Who's Left, and the reason I call it Who's Left is because it shows the beginning of a journey, and it tells the story of how it ends and who's left. So all the participants in the beginning of the book will be revisited at the end of the book to see who's left. Sure, this is Curtis. Curtis Howard. I'm from San Diego, love my city. 619, and I grew up in an area called Encanto, but I started over in the coast, or what they call the coast now, as a kid, and then I moved over to the Encanto area. Went to school, everything over there, elementary, junior high, end up over in the hood. And when I first started junior high, end up over in the hood. And that's when I became familiar, with the homies over there, and started basically claiming the hood. At about 14 years old, got involved in gangs over there when I was 14 years old, And that led, of course, to exposure, to the streets in many different ways, and especially when it came to petty crime. I was introduced to crime. I was introduced to alcohol, to beer, and to beer. I was introduced to weed. Weed wasn't the same as it is now. Weed is like real high powered now, but when I was introduced to weed, it was like shit you grow in your backyard, Acapulco Gold, Colombian, sandwich bags and stuff full of weed. That's what we smoked, and we drank a little beer. It was petty crime and stuff, and I was introduced to the gangs, a little fighting, everything was just like fighting, being tough, everything was just all in, it was just a part of like growing up, Gangs wasn't really taken serious to me then. Yeah, well, as a kid, I lived in an area over what they call the coast now. I lived on a street called Island Street, on like 26 and Island Street. But I was probably like 3, 4, 5 years old at the time I lived on Island Street in the coast. And at about 6 or 7, I moved out to Encanto. And that's where I had the rest of my childhood at, was over in Encanto, and going to elementary school, junior high school, and all that. All my friends and all that shit, was over in Encanto.
And when you were in Encanto, were there a group of kids there already kind of like socializing like they was a thing?
Yeah. Every area got their own little clique already. Everybody got their friends, and it's just a matter of acceptance. Who's the new guy? Is he cool? But I was there from an early age. And since I was a kid, I was one of the ones who actually end up being an original there, because as kids is cool with everybody, so when I moved over there, we was all kids, we was all cool. Then as we start growing up, and becoming teenagers, other people was moving in. They were the new ones because we've been there since we was kids. We didn't really have gangs. The gangs, we didn't have gang in Encanto. We just went to school, raced, I ran track, played some football. We didn't have gangs. That's the reason why I ended up being from the Neighborhood Crips, because Encanto didn't have a gang. So I was exposed to the Crips from the hood before Encanto even started. Later on, Encanto did have gangs, which was comprised of all my childhood friends, from back then, but they wasn't a gang until I started claiming the Neighborhood Crips.
So years later, they formed the Encanto Park Branksters?
Yeah, they was called the Branksters. One of my closest friends, the Michaels, the Michael family, Tony Michael, rest in peace, started the Encanto Park Branksters. And they were a combination of players and gangsters, but they considered themselves players because the Encanto Park Branksters, a lot of them had nice cars. They had got some Cadillacs, and they was like players, they considered, because they had cars, and a lot of people still didn't have cars, but but you know, they did, and they considered themselves to be like players and gangsters you know, kind of combination. Just a few years later, because I remember as I used to be going to the hood, and when I lived in Encanto, I used to be khakied up. I used to be khakied, have on my Godfather, have on my Stacy's, and had the rags hanging. And I used to pass through Encanto Park on my way to the hood. And they used to look at me, you know, and they used to be hanging. That's when they first started hanging out. And they used to see me, and they used to be like, man, look at Curt. Curt's a Crip. And they used to be like, yeah, he is. Yeah, he's a Crip. They would stop me there and say, where you going? I'd be like, I'm over to my hood. They'd be like, damn, man, you a Crip? And I'd be like, yeah. It's like, damn, you know, they kind of was like thinking I was like somebody to look up to because I was banging, you know, and they heard about that, you know, but they wasn't like that, you know. They was still kind of like teenagers, you know. They wasn't taking that shit seriously, you know. So seeing me khakied up and going over to the hood, you know, they was like, damn, Curt is a gang member. You know.
So the Encanto Park Branksters, they weren't Crip or Blood, right?
No, they were Crips when they did start. Now later on, after seeing me going over to the hood, then later on, that's when I started hearing in like 1981. They started in 1981, maybe even before that. Maybe in late 1979, they start calling themselves the Encanto Park Branksters, you know. And that's when I heard of them, and I said, so what you guys, and they was like, you know, we wear white rags and blue rags. So the white bandana, they had a white rag, and they had a blue rag that showed their allegiance to the Crip side. So they were Crips in that regard, you know. Encanto had a set long before a lot of other sets that was out in San Diego, and that even though Encanto now, from what I hear, is Bloods, I hear that there like a lot of Bloods that live in Encanto, but Encanto was Crips first. You know, my childhood friends and all of them from Encanto, they was Crips first. Tony Michael, rest in peace, he started the Branksters. But Tony Michael was the first person killed in San Diego between the Crips and Bloods. He was killed at a house party in neighborhood Crip turf because we embraced the Encanto Park Branksters on my behalf. I introduced them to the hood. So they start coming over to the hood. And Kenwood, my homie Kenwood, Kenny Michael, with Tony's brother, Kenny, I started bringing him to the hood with me. And we named him Kenwood after a street that was in Encanto. One day on our way back from the hood, we looked up at the street sign and we said Kenwood. And we repeated it and the name sounded good. And he said, Kenwood, Kenwood. He said, yeah, that's me. But Kenwood, I was bringing him over to the hood. And then a couple more of them start coming over, and they was known as Curt Dog's friends. Wasn't everybody just was calling them, that's Curt Dog's friends, you know. And that's who they were, you know. And then one night, we had a party on the Vol Street or 49 over in the hood. And that's when the gunplay had just started, but nobody had been killed. It was just, you know, guns was kind of being used, you know, to back people up. People would shoot in the air and try to intimidate you. But we was coming from a history of fighting a lot. So when the guns came out, nobody just came out like popping people right off top. It came out kind of like as intimidation. But now this was the first case where somebody came through shooting, and Tony was at that party that night. He had came through to hood, you know, and attended the party because Encanto was allowed to come over to the hood. They was like cool now with the hood, you know, and some Bloods came through shooting, and he got hit in the head, and he was the first person that died in rivalry between Crips and Bloods, and I was a pallbearer at his funeral. That was the very first death, gang-related death in San Diego between the Crips and the Bloods. And, you know, Tony wasn't really considered a Crip from the hood. He was just in the hood visiting, but it was still a result of them shooting at dudes from the hood.